Here's the title of our talk, Creating Value Through Corporate Governance. And we have a discussion paper that we published in February. Actually, it's a consultation. And don't worry, you have until the end of August to respond. And I very much hope that you will want to respond. I'm afraid it's rather long, but the executive summary is fairly short. And there are 10 key questions that we ask, but there are also another 40 plus other questions which we'd be interested to get feedback on, or anything else come to that. But it's wide-ranging, as we will see. What we're saying, in a nutshell, is governance actually isn't working very well for what we think its purpose ought to be. And its purpose ought to be about ensuring that organisations create sustainable value over time, over the long term. And by value, we're not talking about profit, we're not even talking about just monetary value, we're talking about societal value, and if you can put it that way, environmental value, or maybe a kind of appropriate cost to environmental value, however I'm not sure how you can add economic value, but I think you can add societal value, and you can certainly add monetary value. So this is what we're talking about, is trying to set corporate governance in the context of the wider what's going on in the economy at the moment, and what's going on in society at the moment as well. I enjoyed writing it. I thought it was the most difficult thing I'd ever written until the last paper I've just written, which is about corporate culture. Now that was really difficult. So here we go. This paper builds upon a couple of earlier ones. Some of you might have come across one or other of them. Back in 2008, in October, just after Lehman's crashed, we already had ready a report that we published very soon afterwards called Corporate Governance and the Credit Crunch. We've been writing it for about 9 months or so. But Lehman's really kind of added to the interest of it. We were saying that a lot of what was wrong with the credit crunch was to do with problems in corporate governance. Now, funnily enough, at the time we published it, the likes of the ICGN, the International Corporate Governance Network, were saying, this has nothing to do with corporate governance. Corporate governance was fine. They have changed their tune a bit since. It's a fairly short paper. People found it a nice read, and I'm glad to say that Professor Jill Atkins, who was Jill Solomon, I think based part of her MBA or one of her master's studies around it. So I think a real test of success of this paper would be if anyone actually felt like using this in their own classes. So that's an open invitation. Freely available. These can still be downloaded from the web. After the Credit Crunch paper, we produced Risk and Reward Tempering the Pursuit of Profit. That came out in 2010. That really looked at the behavioural and cultural and ethical aspects of what had gone wrong with the financial crisis, but also looking at how we do risk management as well. That seemed to go down quite well, and I gathered from feedback from our PR people that this is actually the most, apart from anything that Robin Jarvis had written, this was the most successful paper in terms of interest generated that ACCA had published at that time. Quite how they measure this, I don't know, but I wouldn't quibble with that. And then this paper now, which doesn't repeat much of what's in the previous two, but builds on it. I struggled to get it into 25,000 words or so. There's a lot more that could be said, but there's probably far too much that was said, and if I was doing it again, I think I'd write it much shorter, because people don't have time to read so much. So this is what the paper's talking about. We're saying that governance is about creating value. Now, that's not a new idea, and I'm glad to say that IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, say a similar thing in one of their fairly recent papers on corporate governance. So we're on the same wavelength there. But this actually is quite controversial, because you could say, well, actually it's a job of boards and using business judgment to create value. I had a long conversation with Mervyn King, not the Bank of England Mervyn King, but the King Code Mervyn King, about this. And actually, I was expecting him to agree with what we were saying here, but he didn't. And he said, well, no, corporate governance is about setting the structure and all that. I said, but hang on, Mervyn, it says in your code here and your code there, but it was quite a surreal conversation, and we had about 90 minutes together, which it was, and at the end I think we agreed on what we were trying to do. But clearly there's some issues there which need refining, and we did refine what this says a little bit, I think, hopefully to keep moving on board. But you know, whether we succeeded, I don't know. I haven't asked him since. But we're saying that creating value and it's value that contributes to society. I think those are the key things. So if we look at corporate governance at the moment as it's practiced, how well is it creating value or helping to ensure the creation of value? And we're not saying that it's the governance that creates the value, but it's the governance that provides a framework and facilitates and should ensure the appropriate board behaviour and practices and so on that will lead to creation of value. And as we discussed in the paper, we don't think it's doing terribly well. But as I said earlier, we're trying to look at governance in a wider context. So we look at governance, we're interested in what causes economic growth. Now, I'm not an economist. I wish I was. If I was having my time again, I think I'd be studying economics. So I still don't understand what causes economic growth. But the more economists I speak to, the more I realise that they don't either. And I wonder what actually is taught on economics courses. But there we go. Actually, I bought a book recently. It's about that thick on, what's it called? Developmentally, no, that's not the word. Evolutionary economics. And Steven Pinker wrote the foreword, and he says, you know, when he first started economics, he wanted to find the answers to these questions. That's actually about psychology. But I think it's the same thing about economics, because you know, you go to you start studying psychology, you want to know how people think and so on, and then after about, you know, you do your A levels and you do your degree, you still don't really know. And what Pinker was saying in this book on evolutionary psychology tells you how, but I think it's just the same with economics. You can study economics wanting to know how things really happen, and I'm not sure. Anyway, I have studied a bit of economics, so I'm not talking completely through my hat, but almost. Okay, so we postulate what causes economic growth in here in a very simple way. We talk about the nature of money and debt. I mean, what I find astonishing is actually how money is created in the first place, and we give the example in there of how it's done. And I think many economists know it, but maybe then don't accept it, because it is just astonishing how easy it is to create money if you're a bank. And we should all be banks. Okay, so we then talk about how companies create value or not, and we advance a framework for discussing that. And just to emphasise, profit does not equal creating value. And so we get into the subject of measures. And I think here's one of the real problems that we have in corporate governance, but I think it's a problem we have in accounting as well. I don't think the measures are very good. And I'll come on to that later. So we then start to consider how well corporate governance is doing against this framework we're talking about. Well, our conclusion is that governance isn't doing a very good job. So we propose a framework based upon performing, informing and holding to account, which we think could be used to assess governance, and it could be used by code makers around the world to think, actually, are our codes really doing what they really need to be doing, or are we, is it doing something else? Okay. Lessons from the financial crisis. This is a long time ago now, but it's probably worth just going over them briefly. We have a hypothesis of the problem, which I'll come on to in a minute, or several hypotheses. We advanced the accountability framework. That's really a repeat. Okay, so this is where we get into it. You'll be familiar with the boat. The reason for the boat, of course, is where the word governance comes from in the first place. It comes from the Greek word for to steer. So here we have a good example of the Costa Concordia, which didn't steer clear enough away from the rocks, so came a bit unstuck. And this quote, does anyone recognise this? I guess many of you will have looked at the UK Parliamentary Commission Banking Standards report into HBOS. Has anyone looked at that? This, I think, is a brilliant quote. And so I'll let you read that. There's no point me reading it, but what I will read is something else first, which came out from the inquiry. And these are the words of Sir Ronald Garrick in evidence he gave to the inquiry.
And Sir Ronald Garrick was a non-exec director of HBOS, and he was a senior non-exec, and he had other non-exec posts as well. And so in his written evidence he said, "I have no doubt that the HBOS board was by far and away the best board I ever sat on. My recollection of the culture and characteristics of the board was one of openness, transparency, high intellect, integrity, good working relationships between the chairman and chief executive, and a suitable diversity of backgrounds, mix of experience and expertise to maximise effectiveness." And it goes on, "The papers which came to the board meetings were consistently of high quality. If, with the benefit of hindsight, I was asked again if I wanted to sit on this board again, I would say yes." And it goes on, and the quote goes on. But you get the idea. And if you think about it, if you look at HBOS and how it did against our UK Code of Corporate Governance, it certainly ticked the boxes. And it appeared to have good governance. Okay, we now know that the chief exec is alleged to have been a little bit over controlling in the way he did things, and perhaps not encouraging dissent, particularly in relation to Paul Moore, the whistleblower, who said that the organisation was taking risks which were rather too much. What we're left with is we can say corporate governance looks like it's doing, it looks like it's doing a good job until something goes wrong. I was at the ICGN conference in Amsterdam earlier this week, and there was an academic, Jess Loos, I think his name was, Dutchman, who is now with Pricewaterhouse, and he'd been doing some research, and he identified that if you look at the banks that failed, and you look at the banks that didn't fail, and you label the ones that failed bad banks and the ones that didn't fail good banks, well, the bad banks are the ones that did best when it came to a formal assessment of corporate governance. So what I think this is telling us is we have our codes, and it's not to say that the codes are wrong, but the key thing is they're not everything. There's more to getting governance right than what's in the code, and arguably there's some significant things that are missing, such as around the behaviour bit. But if you're reading Sir Ron Garrick's report, then as far as he was concerned, culture and behaviour at the board level was fine. So what is it that was missing that actually still enables organisations to go spectacularly wrong? And by the way, each of our UK banks that failed, there is a different story for each of them. In the case of HBOS, there were 3 different activities, any single one of which would have caused sufficient losses for the banks to require being recapitalised. So it lost a lot of money in its lending in property, particularly in Ireland and the UK. That was where the biggest loss was. I've got the figures in here, but I won't waste your time by looking them up again. It lost a lot of money in its lending on property in other parts of the world, which was under a separate division. But it wasn't just about lending on property. They also had a sort of a treasury function within HBOS, and that managed to lose money. That lost, I think it was at 10 billion, something like that. But any one of those losses was enough. So it wasn't just in one area that the bank made a mistake. So you could think of RBS and think, okay, well if it hadn't taken over which was it? ABN AMRO. If it hadn't taken over ABN AMRO, it might have been all right. But in HBOS's case, it wasn't just one thing, it wasn't just 2. There were 3 things that would have caused major problems for the organisation, but it was all 3, and that was a real problem. Poor old Lloyd's taking it on, eh? There we are. I did an MBA a long time ago, so I'm not a complete academic imposter, but I didn't do very well with this. This is my dissertation, and it didn't get a very good mark from my assessor, unfortunately. And Professor Chambers, who's one of our members, who's Robin knows, some of you may know, he actually wrote to my assessor to say, why didn't I get a better mark?
And the problem was it was the criteria, the measurement criteria. Anyway, it was a bit of a laugh, really. So part of one of the findings from the survey, and it was a survey of finance directors and chairmen, and we wrote to all of the ones in the all listed company finance directors and chairmen we could find the names and addresses of, and 100 replied. I was quite pleased with that in the circumstances, because these people are surveyed to death, as you well know. And one of the questions we asked them is, what do you think the main purpose of corporate governance is? This was in 2002 or 3 we did this. And so one option was, is it optimising, is the main purpose of corporate governance to optimise the ability to create long-term wealth? One. Was it to protect shareholders against loss, or are both equally important? So they only had 3 choices. These results, amazingly symmetrical. So 30% said optimising the ability to create wealth, 30% said protecting shareholders against loss, 40% said both are equally important. Now, the narrative comments that we got in relation to this were really quite fascinating. And some of the comments were on the lines of box ticking gone mad, and to give a knighthood to corporate governance people, obviously referring to Sir Derek Higgs, who just got a knighthood for his work on the role of independent directors. There are some other things in this paper, and I remember I presented it on board a ship, one of these conferences they have on board ships, and Paul Boyle of the FRC was there. Paul took great exception to what I was saying, and I only just managed to keep my job as a result. But it was quite interesting, and I was off message. That was the interesting thing. I can say that now because you now have Stephen Hadrill at the FRC. Okay, so these are our hypotheses as to what's wrong. We think there's confusion about what governance is actually for. I've said what I think the purpose of governance is, and that's one of the things we're consulting about. But arguably it's not that clear. It is now pretty clear in the UK Governance Code, I'm glad to say. We've been saying for years that we should state more clearly what corporate governance is for, and now it does, although quite linking that purpose to all the principles and provisions, I'm not quite sure that there's as much connection as there could be. We're saying that regulation has not led to a healthy corporate culture or effective boards. Now, this is an interesting one which, as an aside, for the last 9 months, whilst apart from producing this, we've been doing a research study looking at culture and behaviour. We've had ESRC co-funding for this, and we've done roundtables to discuss some of these hypotheses and other things in London, in New York, in Brussels, Hong Kong, Dubai and Bangalore, as well as having done a members survey where we had 2,000 responses from members all over the world. And this is a really interesting one. I think the views of people in the UK and the United States and Brussels actually, and we actually had the head of the Corporate Governance Supremo and from the EC in our meeting, but there's general feeling that actually regulation isn't really helping. There's a huge scepticism, cynicism about regulation in this country, in the United States, and I think in Brussels. Funnily enough, though, as you probably know, in developing countries, so in Dubai and, well, I suppose Dubai is developed now, isn't it? But it's probably developing in terms of corporate governance and its rules. And in Bangalore, there is a really earnest desire for more regulation. But you think where they're coming from? They're coming from Bhopal wasn't that long ago for the Indians, when thousands of people died as a result of a gas leak from a Union Carbide plant. Then, of course, there was a factory disaster in Bangladesh a couple of years ago. So, I think for them, regulation is very much part of the answer. You need to have more regulation, it needs to be better enforced. And if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then we are fairly well sated when it comes to regulation. We don't really feel we need any more. But in a developing economy, then where you haven't got so much regulation, you want more of it. So huge difference in attitude towards regulation. But in this country, and I think in the States, the general view is, well, no, regulation hasn't led to a healthy corporate culture or effective boards. But on the other hand, if you had no regulation at all, then things might be worse. But I think the point is it's the incremental regulation, the new regulations that are coming in, particularly in response to the financial crisis, that aren't doing really what's needed, given that there's general recognition that a big part of the problem was a cultural thing. And the view is that the new regulations coming in aren't helping. The measures used to manage performance, I don't think are very good. Our standard measure as accountants is profit. But we all know how easy it is to gain profit. You can stop maintenance, you can stop training, you can stop advertising, for example. So if you want to boost profit in the short term, it's incredibly easy to do so. Now, that's not a problem if you're running the business for the long term, because you won't do silly things like that. On the other hand, if your eye is to the short-term share price, let's say you're an acquisitive company and you're doing everything you can to keep the profits as high as possible, because that's going to be the best thing you can do to keep your share price high, providing people don't realise that you're cutting maintenance and these easy ways of cutting profit. But providing people don't think that you are boosting short-term profits at the expense of long-term, then it's easy to do it, and you can get your share price higher. And you know what? You can actually then start to acquire competitors who do spend the money on maintenance, do spend the money on training and so on to maintain the organisation, and then you can buy one and share price may go up a bit more, you can buy another one and so on. And that's a typical strategy of the takeover organisations. It's been, it's as old as time, or almost as old as time, doing this sort of thing. So if you think about the measures, profit is a rotten measure. But one of the things that we've identified through the culture research, actually it's not just about profit, it's measures generally. And for those of you who are as old as I am, you'll probably remember performance measurement and performance management systems coming in, whereas they weren't really around, I don't think, in the 60s, I don't think they were around in the 70s, but they kind of started flooding in towards the late 80s, maybe earlier but certainly that's where I started to come across them. And then in the 90s it was full steam ahead. And we can all think of examples where measures have had completely unintended consequences. And I'll come on to some of those later. Now, we'd like to think that boards have control over the companies that they run. In actual fact, they've got a lot less control than most people would recognise, and particularly the boards of a high non-exec element. And this has been an interesting thing to research more, I think, wouldn't it? But I know there is some research on it. And I remember at a Henley conference years ago, some academics from Australia or New Zealand were talking about our research, and I thought, hello, boards aren't in control? They must be. Who else is? But quite interesting. Okay, we have some. What's going on here? Ooh, okay. Yeah. Well, we talked about this a bit, but the key thing, we don't measure value by measuring profit. But this is the thing about measures. It's very difficult to find the right measures for the outcomes you want to encourage. So what we'll tend to do is look for proxies. Now, those proxies might be, most of the time, be a good proxy for the outcome that you want, but sometimes they won't be the right. They won't be helpful. But I guess most of us have worked in organisations where we recognise that the targets, which are, if we think about it, they're really just proxies. They're the things that drive the behaviour. They're the things that management focus on, and it's quite easy to lose sight of actually what it is you're really trying to achieve, the outcome, the good outcomes that you want, and that instead people focus on this. I can talk about lots of examples from all sorts of organisations, but I'm sure you can too, and maybe that'd be something to include in the discussion. So this is carrying on the hypothesis, actually, so this actually should be 5, 6, 7 and 8. No, it's not. I'm sorry. No, here's the rest, 5, 6, 7 and 8. Okay. So we say that governance is, we should look at governance as a system.
Now, I'm an engineer, or at least I have a civil engineering degree, and I worked for a couple of years after graduating as an engineer. So I guess that kind of makes me think about systems a little bit. Also, I spent a few years off and on doing internal audit, once when I was at Deloitte, and then later when I was running an NHS internal audit consortium. And in those days, which is a long time ago now, we used to do systems audit. I don't think we do anymore. And also, as an external auditor, we used to do systems audit. We would audit systems. So systems thinking is actually, I think, very useful. And you don't need to be an expert on it. We can just be very simple to think, okay, well, what's the system? Well, we've got a box here where things happen. We've got inputs coming in, and we've got outputs coming out. And then we try and understand what's going on inside the box. I think governance should be looked at in that basis, but also we should recognise that actually there's a purpose behind it. So what's the box for? And of course, the key difficulty is that unlike a system in a factory or workshop or something, then this system involves people, which is a tricky bit. And I think this is where I think we need to create a lot more clever thinking about how we address this people element in the way we construct our governance codes and the enforcement, and then and what the institutions that help work towards it do as well. We think that boards and executives are largely unaccountable. The non-executive element of boards have, certainly in the case of the banks that failed and Enron before that and so on, weren't very good at holding executives to account, and the institutional shareholders weren't very good at holding boards to account. And it's interesting to consider why that is, and perhaps we'll get onto that later. But I think you actually have to question, actually, are institutional shareholders the right people to hold boards to account in the first place, given the structural difficulties that are and disincentives that they face. But yet, I remember after the financial crisis, Lord Miners was saying kind of, well, it's not the government's fault, it's the boards. Oh, and it's the shareholders as well. It was anything but regulation. It was other people's problems. But the idea that the shareholders should have been doing more has clearly stuck, and there is an expectation that shareholders do more. But we must remember that back in 2006 and 2007, shareholders were encouraging HBOS to take on more risk. HBOS was seen as being rather boring by comparison to some of the more racy banks, such as RBS, and so HBOS is being encouraged to do more exciting things. And HBOS wisely said no. But I remember there was an awful lot in the headlines of the FT about it at the time. And we should remember that. So having more involved shareholders isn't necessarily going to help. It will have an effect, but it might not be the effect that people would want to have. When it comes to regulation, now this is not meant to be an accusation of the FRC, but I think it's a general problem that regulators have, particularly when they work in a semi-political environment. Rather than trying to understand the system and what's really going on, they have to pursue things in a fairly incremental way. Very difficult, I think, for anyone to say, all right, well, let's just start again and think, how do we make this work if we didn't already have what we have? But I think that's kind of is what's needed in governance, and that's what the rest of the paper is arguing. Because I think, at the end of the day, you can look at regulation, you can think, has it really addressed the root causes? If you think about Sarbanes-Oxley for a minute, now that was new regulation, but yet Sarbanes-Oxley was kind of a sticking plaster form of regulation, and you can think of a whole host of individual problems that happened at Enron and at WorldCom, and you can see a provision in Sarbanes-Oxley for kind of each of the problems. And you can think, okay, that regulation, that's to do with that happening, and that regulation's to do with that happening. And so it goes on. But it wasn't really, it was sticking plasters, really, on problems, rather than addressing some fundamental causes. And addressing the fundamental causes means going back to this bit, especially the people. So, here's our framework. Now, if I had a stool here, but you can imagine one. So, like any good three-legged stool, if a leg's missing, it falls over.
if you have a wonky leg that's not very stable. So we're saying that to have good governance, which is to basically have governance that ensures that organisations create long-term sustainable value, then we need to have three things. And this is really all about accountability. And the first thing is, well, you need performance. And so you need to have performance of the organisations, performance by the boards and executive within that organisation, and performance by the people working in that organisation. Now, in an ideal world, everyone in the organisation would be working towards a common aim of creating whatever sort of exposition the company or enterprise has of what the organisation is actually there for. Another way of putting it, and if you're looking at it from a public sector point of view, then the purpose of corporate governance is to ensure that organisations work towards their purpose. So if the purpose of a for-profit corporation is to create value over the long term for its shareholders, then that's what it means. But it's basically about purpose rather than. But for generally, when we talk about corporate governance, we're talking about companies, and generally what we're looking for is profit. But we're saying no, it's long-term sustainable value, which hopefully would be reflected in the share price. But that's a proxy indicator for value, and it's not always a very good one. So we need to have performance, so we need everyone in the organisation performing. So we get into this is performance management, but not in the way that we currently practice it, and trying to think, actually, how do we make sure organisations are more effective? So that's internal, well, that's management, I suppose, really. Now, it would be nice if we could just leave everyone to get on with the performing, but we don't live in an ideal world, so we want to know what's going on. And everyone says transparency is a good thing, sunlight's a good disinfectant. So we need information. We need informing about the performing. Now, the informing, I suppose, it needs to be useful, it needs to use good measures, useful proxies, but with some awareness as to when the proxies maybe aren't helping with the measurement that you want to measure. And then the key thing is this holding to account. Again, obviously in an ideal world, this wouldn't need to happen because if people don't need holding to account. And if you have complete trust in people, it's interesting getting into the culture bit. To what extent do you trust people, or to what extent do you want to hold people to account? The more accountability you have, arguably, the harder it is to have a lot of trust. But yet trust is a good thing in an organisation. There's a conflict there. Actually, there's a lot of trade-offs, which our culture paper, which is about to come out, talks about in a lot more detail. Now, we think that there are problems at this level. There are problems at this level where we're not really informing about the right things, and there are huge problems here. And if we look at it, it's not just one stool. We need to look at it in really three different interfaces. So over here, we've got, in terms of accountability, the board should be holding the executive management to account for their performance. And executive management need to be giving the right information that can enable boards to hold them to account properly. The same applies between boards and institutional shareholders. That much we know. Whether institutional shareholders are holding boards to account as well as they should do, I think it's generally reckoned that it's not ideal, but you know, and we can discuss what the problems are. But over here, this bit really is almost completely missing. Now, whose money are these people managing on our, well, I'm giving it away, who are they managing on our behalf? Well, it's us, one way or another. I dare say, for those of you who work in universities, you're probably part of the university superannuation scheme. They are one of the more active investors, which is good, and I think the engagement that they have with companies on the whole is very positive. But USS is relatively unusual for most shareholders, although increasingly shareholders are getting involved. And I think USS have a strong realisation that you know that this is your money that they're managing. On the other hand, you're relatively fortunate if you work in academia being part of a defined benefit pension scheme. if you have a defined contribution scheme, then there is no mechanism whatsoever, really, for the savers to have any influence at all over this lot. This is actually quite a lengthy chain of intermediation here. We've got the investment. We've got the asset owners, you've got the asset managers, you've got advisors, there's a whole load of things going on. So this is a gross oversimplification of what's really happening. But there is no mechanism really for these people to hold those people to account. And I think this is a fundamental problem. Maybe it's an impossible problem to solve, but I don't think it should stop us thinking about it. What's gone on here? Oh, good. Okay. I was afraid something was missing. So, ideally, if you can kind of reconfigure that previous slide into something like this, where you have, boards holding management to account, management holding staff to account, staff doing the performing, management taking all the credit for the staff's performance. No, I shouldn't have said that, should I? You can delete that from the tape. And then the board's taking more credit and so on. And then you've got the fund managers holding the boards nicely to account and the savers holding the fund managers to account. Now, bearing in mind that these people and those people are essentially the same, globally, they're by and large the same people, then you ought to have kind of a nice feedback loop here. Wouldn't that be nice? I think that should be something we should try and aim for. Of course, we're a very long way from that. Okay, equals. Hate these transitions. I normally remove them. A few get left. Oh, there's more. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Well, you get the idea. What else have we got? Yeah, okay. So here, it's not working. And just to go back, so this is in the UK, or United States. Now, in many parts of the world, you don't have a diversified shareholder base. Then the diagram is slightly different because, let me just remind myself what it looks like. It's in here. Well, actually it's not that different. It's a guy who converted my slides into diagrams, left out some of the lines. But what actually happens is this doesn't really happen to the extent you have a sorry, beg your pardon. Yeah, what's in the second diagram is here we'd have another box for dominant shareholder. So the dominant shareholder has a considerable influence on the board, and the savers have much less influence. Now, in an ideal world, the dominant shareholder is actually interested in long-term value creation. So, on the whole, in most organisations, having a dominant shareholder is probably a good thing, providing the dominant shareholder doesn't abuse his or her position. That's the key thing. So, the challenge, of course, where you have a concentrated shareholder base is to make sure that the dominant shareholder doesn't abuse control. The challenge where you have a diversified shareholder base is to make sure that the chief exec doesn't abuse control. That's the difference. But actually, it's a fairly fundamental difference, but that's not that obvious when you look at corporate governance codes around the world. Why is that? Largely because they're all based on the UK code, where we know what it's like. It's like that. And here's the problem. If, when you're writing codes around the world, and ACCA, of course, is a global accounting body, so we look at what goes on around the world, then the codes need to reflect what the local institutions and so on are, local practices. If you're not clear what the purpose of governance is, you're not thinking of it like a system, then the easy thing to do is just go and copy someone else's code and implement that. And then you can say, all the codes, there's convergence on codes, which is a good thing. We all know that convergence is a good thing. Or is it? I don't know it's a good thing. Of course, we had convergence in risk management approaches in banks. And they had such good convergence that when one person wanted to sell a share, they would all want, or an asset, they'd all sell. And when one wanted to buy, they'd all buy. So you actually had a market with one player.
wasn't quite what nature had intended. So it's going back to the purpose of thinking governance and systems. So when you're adopting codes around the world, then bear that in mind. Don't just copy what looks like a good one. And the scary thing is, I remember I was reading a report by, I can't remember if it's Iceland or Finland, about a code they were introducing. And it was all about, following best practice. And what was completely missing is why they were doing it. But they were doing it because they thought that in order to have a healthy capital market in their own country, they needed to have a governance code that would pass muster with world-class codes. That became the purpose, but I think that was a subsidiary purpose. I'm going the right way here, sorry. Helps if you hold it the right way around, doesn't it? So, let's just think about performance for a minute. I wish I'd invented this, but I haven't. Back in the 90s, I used to work as a consultant doing something called control and risk self-assessment. And this is a framework that was developed by the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants, and it's called the Criteria on Control. I have actually got a soft copy of this now, but it's very difficult to find on the internet. I have a feeling that ACCA, the Canadian Institute, have recently put it back on, because I've been encouraging them to for years, because I think it's so helpful. What this talks about is to be in control in an organisation. So it's a framework for assessing control. But what I like about it, unlike COSO, which you may have come across, is quite difficult to get your head around, I find. This one is very simple, and it works at lots of different levels. So think if you're an individual or a family. If we want to have a nice family, so let's be clear about our purpose. Have a nice family, happy children, and so on. Happy parents. And in order to achieve that purpose, you need to have commitment. But you also need to be capable of achieving it. You need to do something. No good just having commitment and capability. You need to take action, and ideally you'd learn from what you've done, and you'd monitor whether what you're doing is working, and that can then feed back into purpose. The COCO framework builds upon that, and a lot of different elements, and it's reproduced in the paper. This is a wonderful framework that you can use in workshops with boards downwards, and I've used it. I just think it's wonderful, and I want to start doing it again because I think there's a real need for this now. I'd adopted this in another one of my MBA dissertations where I got a failure, whereas colleagues of mine who'd adopted the same thing in theirs, they got very good marks. So I think there's something strange going on here, but obviously I'm not cut out to be an academic. Okay, now you'll recognise this. Do you recognise this? Integrated Reporting Framework. International Integrated Reporting Framework. Now this is a system, which is, so I like it. It's got inputs over here, it's got outputs over there, it's got what goes on in the organisation, but this is the value creation process as articulated by the IIRC. I think it's worth listing because I think we all want the integrated reporting framework to succeed. We may not like every single aspect. I know a lot of people are unhappy with bits of it, but I'm sure conceptually we all think it's heading in the right direction. We want it to work. I think this is a very interesting example. This is over here. We've got the capitals, which have you all come across this, or is it worth me taking a moment to explain it? Okay, right. So the idea, and this is my understanding of it anyway, we're talking about capitals, and there are different types of capital, and I'm saying, this is value in another way, so it's not just profit. So you can have financial capital, you can have manufacturer capital, intellectual capital, human capital. Quite what the difference between the two, I'm not entirely sure. Social and relationship capital, and natural capital. So that would be natural resources and environmental resources. So an organisation will have these as inputs going in. It will start with these capitals, or it will be using its own money, its own manufactured plant and equipment or assets, its people, and working within society and using natural resources. Then over here, the organisation transforms these capitals and then
for the organisation, if it's a for-profit one, hopefully adds to the financial capital. But what's interesting is to know, well, is it making lots of financial capital at the expense, at an unacceptable expense of natural capital or societal relationship capital? So what the integrated reporting framework is calling for is for companies to consider what they do within their own business model and how that relates to the transformation of capitals, and to report what goes on. The reporting framework, I think it stopped short of actually saying you should be trying to report in a... it's fairly vague on how companies should report what they've done here, but it's a general idea, and I suppose some of these things are actually very difficult to report on. It's hard enough to report on financial results, let alone other results, but it shouldn't stop us trying. And I think if you combine that model with the previous one, so this is something that you can use for assessing what goes on within the organisation, for whether the organisation is healthy, whether the people in it are pulling in the right direction, working together, or whether you have challenging priorities where you've got one group are working in one direction, another lot working in a very different direction, which can end up causing bottlenecks or dysfunction or whatever. And our culture study is really one of looking at what causes dysfunction. Combine it with that at a slightly more macro level, I think you've got some quite interesting ways of assessing performance. And then the informing bit, I think, should be about report informing on this and informing on that. Now, this is primarily going to be for internal reporting purposes. That, I think, is for internal and external reporting purposes. And I would hope that institutional shareholders who are taking an interest in this will expect to have some really intelligent reports taking place on what companies are doing here, which should give them a very good basis then to have a constructive engagement with companies, rather than about, is your chairman separate enough from the chief executive and so on, and have you got the right number of independent directors? So I'll talk about economic growth. Well, this is my way of thinking what causes economic growth. You find resources in the ground, or or by exploration and so on, or you basically find a better way of doing something, working on those resources. That I think is about it in a nutshell. And you can read economics books full of other stuff, but if you haven't got those working, it's not going to work. I think it's kind of taken for granted in the economics textbooks that this is happening, but it's fundamental because it doesn't happen on its own. So if we're looking at corporate governance and we're looking at, okay, well, if I was speaking a year ago, you would have all agreed with me if I said that the economy seemed to be going nowhere. Of course, now the economy is doing wonderfully well. But let's remember there's another way of creating economic growth, or at least creating something that looks like economic growth and is measured as an indicator of economic growth. If you want to boost GDP, all you need to do is start pumping money into the economy, as we're doing, which might work, might not. I mean, it seems really scary to me. At the moment it looks like it's working, but for how long? If you have a problem caused by a bubble and too much debt, how can you help to solve that by creating more debt? That one is lost on me, but I really don't know what I'm talking about. But yet, do the people who do think they know what they're talking about know what they're talking about? That I think we could all engage on this. But the practices that government do of basically trying to massage the figures, I think by pumping money into the system and so on, I don't think that's going to get real growth going. If you want to have real growth, this is what you need to do. This, I think, is what government should be doing. But more importantly, it's what organisations, what the public sector and the private sector should be engaging on to do things better in a way that is not too detrimental to these capitals here. That's the challenge, and this is where I feel policy should be going. And this, if we're looking for regulators to provide a steer, I think they could be trying to say, actually, this is what governance is about. At least to kind of create that framework for thinking. Okay.
You'll all have heard of Adam Smith, I'm sure. I haven't read all of Wealth of Nations, but this is a bit of it I came across. There are three types of income. You can have wages, you can have profit, and you can have rent. The wages are what you'd expect them to be. Rent you can get from land. Profit is what the Adam Smith businesses did. And Adam Smith was of the view that if you try and have social engineering to try and find ways of making organisations create profit to the benefit of society, it wasn't going to work as well for society as just allowing them to get on with it because of the invisible guiding hand. But what we saw very clearly in the financial crisis was this form of rent, where it's economic rent, where you have essentially you can have organisations and banks were clearly one type of organisation which could use the position that they are in to basically help themselves to wealth that had been created by other people. So they weren't helping to create wealth, they were merely appropriating it. And it's not to say that we need banks, and banks have a very important social purpose, which is one of providing liquidity and finance and so on. Quite how that whole thing is sustainable, given the debt bit of it, I don't know, but that's way above my pay grade to consider. But if I think about, I am an accountant, I'm a qualified accountant, and I would like to see our accounts providing some useful information that would distinguish between whether the organisation is actually creating proper profit in the Adam Smith sense of the word, or whether it's creating profit derived from economic rent extraction. I'd also like to see our accounting system making it clear whether that we are. I'd like to see a profit and loss account where we've got, or rather an income and expenditure account, I should say, where we've got good expenditure and bad expenditure. And of course what you want organisations to do is cut out the bad expenditure, unnecessary expenditure, but keep the necessary expenditure. Our accounting framework doesn't actually allow for that. Now shouldn't it do that? Seems to me it should. But this is a personal view I'm expressing, but it is in here. It's not, it's not actually ACCA policy yet, but I'm hoping it might become so at some point. I mean, colleagues of mine are quite sympathetic to this. The members on our Governance, Risk and Performance Forum are very sympathetic to this, but actually saying to an organisation, hang on a minute, for 100 years you've not actually been, you need to think again, that's a bit harder. So ultimately I'd like to see a sort of a yin-yang relationship where we have business working in harmony with society, because business can't operate without society. Society, I would say, in any modern economy, needs business too to be part of the wealth creation process, and that then requires this framework to work. So I hope I've whetted your appetite to want to have a look at the paper. Here's the web link. You can write that down. I'll talk for a long time to give you long enough to write it down. But on this page, so as well as the paper, there's a questionnaire which you can download or you can complete online. So you can respond to the consultation online if you want to. There's also a couple of videos, and there lower down is a whole load of other resources, so there's links to the earlier papers I mentioned and other papers that we put out over the years. It's all available for download. And also one of our Governance, Risk and Performance Forum members has written a simple board version of this that as a tool that boards could use to assess whether they can improve the way they help to create value. So if anyone wants to get hold of me, I'm afraid I haven't got any cards with me, but that's where you can find me.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.